two,
Great.
One, lift off, all engines running.
Okay. I feel like
thank you, Robert.
I need to stretch even before this starts, but thank you all. I imagine people will trickle in, but let me share roughly the agenda.
What is this? Who are we?
Okay, we are the East Bay Gray Panthers and friends, and we are today hosting a pretty, well, the author of an incredible piece of research that blew my mind and greatly expanded my understanding. So I'm really happy that we agreed to host him today. So Gene Slater, so let me just say a little about, I first heard of him really out of the blue because he was speaking to the California Historical Society and I subscribed, and I heard about his book, Freedom to Discriminate, how realtors conspired to segregate cities and divide America. And his work is a lot of historical research, but it's mesmerizing. So we're going to actually start today with his video because he's not available till 2 p.m. We can have a little bit of time for announcements, or we can do them at the end, but none of his talks that I can find, and there are multiple ones on YouTube. So I encourage you to look up Gene Slater. I'm going to show one from the San Francisco Public Library from 2022. His work, I just want to share it because it so informed my way of thinking about the housing crisis, because we probably all know now housing is too important to leave to the market. Random actors acting out of self-interest are not functioning to provide housing for all, let alone even a larger and larger minority of renters who are now becoming a majority here in California. So this, I did want to say that I hope afterwards we'll have conversation, but we're going to talk to him and you can raise questions, but he is going to speak at length. We can ask good questions, and Carol and I really want him to speak about the role of private equity because that's the policy area that he's working on now. This is a man with 40 years of experience in affordable housing, public housing finance. He's been an advisor across the country to numerous states, Washington, D.C. So this is someone who's talked to a lot of people and dived into a lot of situations that he then was able to to write it up with additional research. And so I respect that very much. He's both a person with deep commitments to social justice, but his primary functioning now is to be a housing consultant, an expert, a senior advisor. And he's currently working on legislation in Congress to limit the reach of private equity hedge funds to buy up large swaths of rental and homeowner housing. So at the end, we're going to ask him to address that. But this is a chance for us to hear from him the story of the National Association of Realtors and the California Association of Realtors, and the realtors who were created the trademarked word realtors. Not everyone is a realtor because you got to pay a lot of money to belong to this elite group. But they have been funding oppositional campaigns and candidates against rent control, against Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. They have been funding, and I'll talk, if we have a time, we're going to maybe have a separate session about the research I've found. So let me just get to the point with with the video. I see Norma has your hand up. You want to make a statement about the dregs of capitalism beating us down? Please do, Inspire us. Why are we here?
Need to inspire us. Everybody knows that this is a big concern, and you've emphasized it and have done a great job and brought in somebody that's on point. The thing is, you said that it relates to the housing problem. I think that people generally cannot pay $2,000 a month rent. Rent is theft. So this is not about solving the housing problem. Social housing, of course, is what solves the housing problem. And he probably is not going to be dealing with that at all, or needs to include that in his presentation. But I think that it is incorrect to include the idea that his research and his presentation, the content, are addressing the housing problem. They're not. They're describing the crap that's gone on all this time and continues to go on.
Thank you, Norma. I will say that in my mind, and I'm hoping we all will begin to see the connections between the folks who have actively promoted discriminatory housing, created segregated neighborhoods, that this is an active group that still operates in politics today. We know money influences politics, but it was shocking somewhat to me to dive in deep and see the conversations that this particular club, elite club, that for many years didn't allow women or Blacks or any minorities into their elite club. It's really, anyway, I don't need to persuade you more. But I will say, I believe, and maybe other people have opinions, that the more we understand history, the more we can think about creating solutions that at least are a better grade of problem. I mean, we're still human beings. So Julia, why don't you share, and then I'll put up the video.
I just wanted to recommend, if you haven't read it yet, the book, The Color of Law, which reveals how our government was also colluding to create the same housing discrimination. There were legal things happening.
Yep.
And that's a very informative book also that everyone should read.
Yes. And he certainly credits that book, but he is actually going deeper than that book. Who supplied the government and the banks with redlining maps? Associations of realtors in cities across the country, because they had created them for their own use. So yeah, it's a great book. And, you know, hopefully all of these have YouTube videos on them. So those of us who aren't reading quite as much as we were. I did want to acknowledge Carol Morozovich, Cheryl White, Ann Harvey, and other people who've already been greeted, Kristen. And I want to note Lisa Rudman is from the San Francisco Public Press, which is an alternative newspaper, and they're interested in this story and the larger story of social housing, what that might look like here in the Bay Area. So Lisa, welcome. Margot Smith is here. I just want to welcome you because I'm hoping you'll share this information with the Wellstone Club. Anyway, why don't I get started with the video? Our guest will be here at 2 p.m. He'll speak at least till 3. And I see Jeff Levin from EBHO. Welcome as well. So Gene Slater will be here at 2 to pick up the story that we're starting with the video, if that's all right. And thanks. And I know we're going to have an active chat. So everyone who can see the chat, please take a look. And Carol, if you see something good, you know, we'll jump in at the break to share. Okay, let me do my best here to share. I get a little, I'm trying to, oh, no, that's the wrong, sorry. I need host tools, share screen. There we go. Where is it? Come Come on. Yeah, Rains, can you help me here? I want to actually share. Oh, there it is. Sorry, it's a new button. There we go. Okay. There we go. No, I don't. Okay. So just to let you know, there are quite a few videos on the web because he gave a number of talks when the book was published by Heyday Press in 2021. But it has never gotten enough publicity or book reviews even. So if you're inspired, please bring that up. Think about that. Okay, so these are some of the topics that he covers, just so you can see that. And here are some of the video elements, even though it goes on for half an hour after these topics. So let me blow it up and get started, and we'll have the real person hear it too. Okay.
You need to have stop share, Betsy, and then say share audio. So stop it and check the box for share audio.
I didn't
down to
see
the
that.
bottom. All right, when you hit share and you're choosing the list, at the bottom there's a checkbox.
I've now lost the video that I was showing.
Okay, that's fine.
Oh, there it is. Okay, there is no share sound. Okay, there we go. Optimized for video clip. Okay, thank you all. Thank you. That's why we all need more people in the room to help make things good. Okay, it's paused.
Oh, so you need to if you could go to your video and hit escape, get out of full screen in order to do this.
All right.
Yeah, go back to where you were.
I can't. So I'm gonna have to stop the share.
There.
I see all your beautiful faces. Forgive my technical challenges.
So simply switch back to the video.
Yes.
On your Windows menu,
yes,
it'll pull up
I'm
full
looking
screen.
At it.
Get out of full screen mode. Take it back to where you were before.
Yes.
And then go share.
The challenge. Okay. So let me hopefully that all works.
Just for your information, there is a little view option in the very far right-hand corner that let you get out of full screen.
Right. Thank you, Norma.
I am Rains, could you come in?
Yep,
I'm in some kind of Zoom hell, 12th order of Zoom hell that isn't showing me what I'm trying to share. It's okay.
Okay, let's switch over. I need to skip. Yeah.
Here. Okay, to the best of my knowledge, this is the video. But when it shows up, it does not show when I share it.
First, stop. Then switch to
Here, hang on. Let's turn off our sound.
Good afternoon, everybody.
We're fine.
No.
Okay. Switch to the video.
Hi, Arlene.
Exit full screen. Now share.
Carol Morosevich, did you get my note about being stupid about the $1 per signature?
No.
Well, I wrote you a note that you were right. $1 per signature, not $1.50. I was counting up.
Official documents from leaders of the real estate industry. Slater reveals how realtors systematically created.
Yes. Can you resume? I'm hearing it.
And justified residential segregation. Gene Slater has served as a senior advisor on housing for federal, state, and local agencies for over 40 years. He co-founded and chairs CSG Advisors, which has been one of the nation's leading advisors on affordable housing for decades. His projects have received numerous national awards, and in the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2009, he helped design the program by which the United States Treasury financed homes for 110,000 first-time home buyers. He holds a degree from Columbia, MIT, and Stanford. He was born and raised in Brooklyn, but now he's a Bay Area person. So without further ado, Mr. Gene Slater.
Thank you very much. How did America become a place where every city is racially divided in almost identical ways, and where a conservative vision of freedom as your absolute personal rights to limit the rights of others has shifted the country to the right for more than 50 years? These are two defining
Please stand by. We're switching over here.
What's going on? I don't hear anything.
We're briefly interrupted. Please stand by.
features of modern America. And the history I'm going to show shows how deeply they are connected, that both were inventions of the nation's organized real estate industry, the realtors, to sell homes by permanently dividing Americans. So I'll present this as a series of like 4 questions that I'll try and answer to frame this. One was, how was segregation invented? Then what role did the Bay Area and California particularly play why did they play such a central national role in segregation? Then how did the politics of perpetuating segregation, particularly in California, but how did those politics, the effort that shape our modern ideological divides today, our modern politics? And then last, how does segregation remain so powerful today, more than 50 years after fair housing was finally passed? So let me start with how segregation was invented. So the myth that got promoted by the realtors, and by the realtors I should say, we now think of them as individuals selling homes, but the realtors who were created in the early 1900s as local real estate boards and then trademarked the name realtors were very quickly in the early 1900s became an enormously powerful cartel, who, even though there were like 3 or 4% of the brokers in the country or in any given area, came to dominate 80% of home sales through the multiple listing service they created that allowed them to double commissions and make those stick. These were all white real estate boards, very socially exclusive. And they became and were viewed by Congress as the most powerful lobbyists in the country by mid-century. They created the Appraisal Institute, what's now the National Institute of Home Builders, property management, apartment management. All these were sort of their functions, and their associate members were the banks and the title companies and everybody else involved in the real estate industry. And many of the leading realtors became the country's leading developers. So that's who the realtors were. So one of the myths that they used after they had created segregation was that it was natural, normal, historical. It had always been this way. So we have a myth that got accepted by both blacks and whites. It's sort of like, well, it must have always
What's going on?
been like this. But if you go back to the early 1900s, you find that American cities were not racially divided. People lived by where they could afford rather than by their ancestry. Sort of one of my aha moments in doing this research was a quote from J.B. Loving, who was a black real estate broker in Los Angeles in 1904, who said, the Negroes of the city have proudly refused to segregate themselves, but live in many of the best neighborhoods, with the best homes and the best infrastructure. And that was true not only in Los Angeles, and the fastest growing city in the country, but it was true throughout the country. It was true in in border cities like Louisville, Washington, St. Louis, where there were hundreds of racially mixed blocks. So segregation was something new. It was an invention, like the airplane was invented, and about the same time as the airplane. And realtors would lend, and the power to do it, it took to create segregation, you had to racially divide the country's historically rambunctious free real estate market. So it took the power of this realtor cartel, their code of ethics that would throw out anybody who sold a home to a minority, their ability to basically destroy the business of anybody in real estate who didn't subscribe to the approach that they did. It took that effort to organize the country's free markets and to racially separate them. And it's an effort that transformed America's courts, America's suburbs, our local governments. And that you'll see as a theme through this, that what it took to create segregation really changed the country fundamentally for everybody. Not only those whose lives are so damaged by permanently excluding them, but for all Americans. So I quoted that Black real estate agent in Los Angeles in 1904 about not segregating themselves and living in many areas. By 1917, another Black in Los Angeles resident said, "The whites have encircled us with invisible walls, and they've made it impossible to move beyond those walls." And the Los Angeles Housing Commission, now one of our clients, back in the early 1910s said it would be possible for Mexican Americans to find lots of places to live in Los Angeles if only every, new subdivision wasn't racially restricted. So what I want to turn to, this was a myth that segregation was natural and historic. Similarly, it was a myth of birds of a feather flock together. Even in immigrant neighborhoods where people, came and were in the same neighborhood speaking the same language, these were always mixed and never one ethnic group dominated, and people moved out, all ethnic groups moved out as quickly as they could to find better housing. That was what segregation prevented when it came to those who it excluded. Nor was segregation a matter of not being able to afford homes. In fact, the consequence of segregation, like any restricted market, is it pushed up the prices that African Americans had to pay by 20 or 30% more than in similar, for the same condition, housing elsewhere. Nor was segregation simply the result of racism. Obviously, racism, drove segregation, but racism was just as strong, if not stronger, in 1900 than it was in 1920 or 1950 or in the center of the story I'm going to tell in the 1960s. It took organized power of the real estate industry to transform the free markets. So it's important to recognize it as something new in America, something that hadn't existed and had to be created. And I'll tell this story. So my second question is, how did the Bay Area and California play such a central role in the creation and the maintenance of segregation? So if you want to find the first segregated, racially restricted neighborhood in the United States, go to Berkeley, a mile from the campus, to the area near the Claremont Hotel, where a subdivision was created in 1905 by Duncan McDuffie, who was the leader of the firm that's now still is Mason McDuffie, whose signs you'll see at open houses all over the Bay Area. McDuffie was an ardent environmentalist. He later became, for many years, the national president of the Sierra Club and helped create the Save the Redwoods League and California's park system. McDuffie had a vision of creating subdivisions not in the way that they were usually created at the time, which is just you lay out paper streets and market homes. But he had a vision of creating environmentally beautiful subdivisions. And you can see in Claremont, he later did St. Francis Wood, and many subdivisions, high-end subdivision of the Bay Area, to create the highest end subdivisions with landscape planning by the likes of the Olmsted brothers, with topographic streets and preserving the trees. And part of doing that, this was a real estate finance problem he was solving. Part of doing that was, if you build such a large subdivision with expensive costs and infrastructure, you have to know what's going to happen to that property over the 5 or 7 years it's going to take to sell those lots. Remember, subdividers at the time, they simply divided lots. They weren't home builders. Homes got built individually or by small contractors back in the early 1900s. So to create this subdivision, he used a new idea that had just been used to development outside Baltimore of covenants, restrictive covenants that would impose on each owner of a lot and say, there's certain things you can't do here. You have to build a house of at least a certain size or at least a certain price, because you wanted this to remain a high-end area. You can't have commercial development. You can't build an apartment house. You can't have a brothel. You can't have bars. And to these, he added one more covenant that hadn't been used in America at this time, partly because they didn't know the courts would uphold it. He created a covenant that said, for the next 30 years and perpetuating thereafter, no non-Caucasian can ever live here except as a servant. And in selling this idea of covenants, this was the restrictions on owners. McDuffie was the first having to convince, through his salesman, buyers who would say, well, it's not, un-Americans limit what I can do with my property. And they said, no, it's not the restrictions on you which matter. It's the restrictions on your neighbors which count. To help enforce these covenants, McDuffie, and at the same time a developer, J.C. Nichols in Kansas City, created the first homeowners associations in America. So you want to know where homeowners associations they came from? They came to enforce these covenants. And if you ask, why was McDuffie imposing these racial covenants for this very high-end development? You know, the most expensive house lots in the Bay Area at a time when the minority population of Bay Area was very small. It was hardly likely the first Japanese immigrants could buy homes there, or African Americans. This was really a form of social cachet, and saying your children are always going to play with children like them. He called this planning for permanence. And this approach, these restrictive covenants, and these racial covenants proved so popular that they, within a year or two, started being used in high-end developments throughout California, Beverly Hills, LA, Los Angeles, other parts of the Bay Area. McDuffie used these to build homes, restricted homes for 100,000 Bay Area residents. And so much was this seen as like part of the social establishment. He was a progressive in the spirit of Teddy Roosevelt. His partner, C.C. Young, became Speaker of the State Assembly and later, Governor of California. McDuffie was appointed all these positions to reinforce. But racial covenants originally were intended as a way to limit what could happen on one's own property. But realtors in existing neighborhoods said, this is a great technique for selling homes here too, and for increasing their value and assuring customers of what will happen around them. So they began basically hiring people who went door to door with petitions, which you would sign, putting a covenant on your own home that would go into effect when 75% of the people bought such homes. And this covenant plan, perfected in Pasadena, became widely used in Berkeley and in Oakland, spread across the country. So you now had both new developments and you had existing homes covered by the same approach.
Welcome, Gene. Welcome in person. I know you got here a couple minutes ago. Are you able to share your video? Gene? Here, let's see. Whoops. Oh, there he is.
Good.
Let's try to
Okay.
pin you.
Boy, that was so much a better presentation than I could make today. So you ought to keep watching it, and I'll pitch in with questions once it's done. That's, I think.
Maybe, but
All
I
right, up to you.
did want to ask, and I know there may be a couple of questions already. But I wanted to ask, in another video you did with the BET, Black Entertainment Network, one of the, I don't know, columnists who did a book section with you, you spend a little more time telling us, who is non-Caucasian and how that has evolved. So maybe you could just take a couple minutes
Sure.
to understand that even more clearly, that it didn't start with just
Right.
black and white. This
Right.
was not
So
the
Caucasian
equation then.
in the early 1900s meant, and continued to mean for many years, let's see, it certainly meant Black Mexican Americans, as they were then called, Japanese and Chinese. In fact, in 1927, a Stanford professor sent out a survey to all the real estate boards in California. He was interested in how Japanese trade and how Japanese were being treated in California. But every realty board had to answer the following question. This is up online in the Hoover Institute, online with Hoover Institute. And they showed, and there was a questionnaire with boxes to check. How do you deal with each of these problematic groups, right? How do you deal in your community, in your neighborhood? What do you do to stop them? Or, but it also had indicate any others. And so you can see from this list, Jews, Syrians, Russians, Turks, South Indians, Italians, basically anything that wasn't Northern and Western European. And that was true if you look at the redlining maps in the 30s as to who was viewed as had to be protected against. There were differences by area, like in Long Island, Italians were very much prohibited from buying into neighborhoods because the covenants would say non-Caucasian generally, and are prohibited. But in San Jose, for example, they were seen as a better alternative to the Japanese and Chinese who were, infiltrating neighborhoods. So they were subject to less discrimination. So this is sort of like, it's who the realty boards decided and the developers decided was not acceptable. And over time, that changed, particularly, in the course of World War II and, immediate post-war, most other, European ancestry people were allowed in. And then starting in the 50s, some Asian Americans gradually, and even by the end of the 50s, some, Hispanic Americans. But when they were asked, well, why can't you allow Blacks in the subdivision in Los Angeles, like in the 50s? Well, we have to draw the line somewhere, because the whole purpose of this entire system was to say there's an outgroup who's not allowed. So maybe that, and this is what I'm describing about people becoming white is not true solely of, residential. It was happening, in labor unions and all sorts of other ways in America, in American life. But residential ultimately reflected the same things.
Gene, do you want to take a question? This is a Gabby group. We will have a lot to say. Some of them will be questions, but I really want us to get the gist of the eras that you decade by decade, you've documented.
I think actually my video where I'm talking, that you
Is
were
better.
showing is probably better, and I'll listen in. And if somebody has a question that isn't about the history, I could take it now. But why don't we get through the history? That would be my suggestion. It's up to you.
Yeah, I'd like to wait for general
Okay.
questions or statements until we
Okay.
get the nugget of your book, because then there's the, what do we do with this? Carol, I'm inviting you to put your question in chat unless there's some clarifying thing that only Gene can answer. Okay, I appreciate it.
I'll look at the chat while people are
Yeah,
talking,
yeah, thank
while
you.
my video's going.
Let's see, where is the, oh, you know what? Where is the screen that I was doing before? Here we
It's
go.
always,
There we
yeah,
go.
go to, make sure it's not full screen.
Oh my gosh.
So, for best results, Betsy, stop sharing, exit full screen in the video, and then share from there again.
Okay. To the best of my
Oh.
knowledge, I'm not in full screen.
You
All right.
specifically exited
You know-
because I'm not.
Okay, Carol, do you want to ask your question briefly and that while I get the video back going? Did we lose?
Switch to the video on the Windows menu, escape, get out of full screen mode, and reshare that window. It shows that it's Google search in your list. Wrong window. Yep. Yeah. Stop sharing.
Okay, I'm having trouble. So why don't we take a couple questions? Maybe ask them briefly and you can answer it while I figure out once again why I can't seem to
Or
find the
or
video.
if somebody can, if somebody else can share it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Well,
you
you
can.
I'm
okay,
game.
so
What-
Wait.
Tell Margot to unmute. Margot, you need
Margot,
to unmute.
Unmute.
Yes,
oh, I thought you had a
Question.
question.
yes,
Do you have a
well,
question, Margot?
yes, well, they accuse our current housing process as a result of the racism and the zoning at the turn of the century. And my take on it is the whole country
Escape.
racism. Why do we
Now you can share.
going with this? Thank you.
You're muted.
I'm sorry, I was hard to hear. Say that again. What's
Some of the city council people are blaming the zoning that you're talking about at the turn of the century for our current housing problem. And my thinking on it is that the whole country was racist at the time. Why is Berkeley so important in that issue?
I don't think Berkeley is, I mean, it was important as a pioneer in California. It also had the first single family zoning in America that was introduced by McDuffie to protect his subdivision by prohibiting a Negro dance hall in Elmhurst. And so that's where single family zoning originated from. And I think the whole history of single family zoning in America, of zoning in general, came out of the same philosophy that led to racial discrimination, out of the realtors' belief that, in homogeneity was the key to stability in real estate. Homogeneity of uses, of types of buildings, of every aspect, and of people. And that became a national trend, and McDuffie from Berkeley and Nichols from Kansas City were among the leaders of zoning, the creation of zoning and city planning across the country. And then fragmentation of metropolitan areas into lots of individual suburbs rather than cities, larger cities continuing to expand by providing utilities for customers. That started in the 1920s. So we basically built up a set of local governments and of commitments to land use controls that all come from this same effort. I don't know that, I mean, I wouldn't claim Berkeley is the only important place in the country. Kansas City was equally important.
I did find the video, and I should be able to share it now. Are we good for now? Yeah, you know, so just Kelly in chat, every city with an urban real estate market had a real estate board that was like quasi-judicial. So yes, most cities, most states, if not all of them, were covered by this kind of history of the real estate, of the realtors, this particular subset of real estate.
Right, there were real estate
people.
boards in like 500 communities or more across the country.
So may I
Yeah.
start the video again, I think. There
And
it is.
California became the epicenter for the creation of these racial covenants that quickly spread across the country. In the 1930s, when FHA was created by the federal government, one of the, in many ways, most brilliant and most powerful housing inventions in the history of the world, created the low down payment mortgage, fixed rate, fully amortized, and you couldn't get at the time. It made the cost of buying a home no higher than it was to rent for many people. Created all the vast new subdivisions of the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s. It was the realtors who were the prime lobbyists for this, the shapers of it. Their chief underwriter became the first chief underwriter of FHA. Their most active field office was in Los Angeles, where it was headed by a former key realtor in Los Angeles. And it was the realtors in each city who did the first drafts of what became the redlining maps. You know, everybody talks about redlining maps now. At the time, they were actually secret. The NACP, vast efforts, finally found some of the racist language in the underwriting manuals. But these redlining maps, you know, weren't visible or available, you know, for 30 or 40 years. In 1940, I'm just giving a quick history of this through the lens of California, because it's important to understand what happened here. Finally, in 1948, the Supreme Court ruled in Shelley versus Kramer that courts couldn't enforce racial covenants. And the realtors in California sort of apocalyptically reacted by proposing a US constitutional amendment that would overturn the 14th Amendment and would create apartheid in America illegally. This was, zoning hadn't allowed, you know, couldn't be used racially because that was government control. And so zoning had become an adjunct to racial covenants. It was Duncan McDuffie in Berkeley, chairman of the Berkeley Planning Board in 1916, created the first single-family zoning in America. Why? Because he wanted to prevent a Negro dance hall from being built in Elmwood, a little ways away from his own subdivision. So zoning was created by the realtors. It was they who created zoning and, anyway, city planning in the country as an adjunct, as a support for, but not directly doing covenants. So back in 1948, they proposed this constitutional amendment, same year as apartheid in South Africa. But on the advice of their lawyers, they said there are quieter ways you can do this. You can keep putting covenants on, you just can't enforce them. And so if you look at Westlake, Daly City, the largest homeowners association in California, that was done that way. They used racial steering. So powerful was the racial steering mechanism and the code of ethics of the realtors and their control. They never allowed, by the 1960s, there wasn't a single African American among the 40,000 realtors in California or 80,000 nationally. So powerful was this that here in the 1950s, in the Bay Area, then is now one of the more liberal parts of the country, out of 325,000 new single-family homes, 50 were sold without regard to race. In the Palo Alto area, 600 brokers who were surveyed, only 3 would even consider showing a home minority area. a shown home in a white area to a minority. So that's how powerful segregation was. And how California, in many ways, because it had half the realtors in the country and so much of the real estate industry, served as a national model for this. So let me turn, now I'm going to turn the page, both in time, but also in terms of the consequences for our American politics today. I want to talk about how the effort to perpetuate segregation, to defeat the civil rights movement, to prevent fair housing, how that shapes our ideological divides and created the conservative vision of freedom that's come to dominate much of American politics, and that we see on issue after issue, from guns to abortion to campaign contributions to dealing with climate change to vaccines. Much of this came in 1963 and 1964, when the realtors faced a fair housing law in California, first law with some teeth and administrative enforcement mechanism called the Rumford Act. In some states, in a few states, in Colorado and Massachusetts,
You're muted, Betsy. You're muted.
He's frozen.
We're working on it. Stand by.
My
Betsy,
apologies. I must have done something on my screen, which I shouldn't have done. So let's try again. Maybe we should pause. Is there any clarifying questions that you want to ask that isn't at this point about what Gene already said? Gene, are you still there?
I see some hands.
All right.
sorry, I'm back. Yeah.
Oh, great.
I was on mute. Okay.
I
see hands from Kelly and one other.
I'm-
Kelly and Willie.
Yeah, we why don't Willie and Kelly, I think you already asked a question. So we're going live for a little bit and then we'll go back to the video thanks.
Okay, so I think
Kelly, you already okay.
Go ahead.
I think Willie and I are coming from the same point, is why is Berkeley labeled as first? I found racial covenants in Minneapolis preceded Berkeley.
In what year?
It was in January, I think 1915. I'm not in front of my computer, I'm on my iPad.
Because Berkeley was in 1905.
Okay. I didn't.
But more important, if there was some covenant somewhere else, more important was that it was really McDuffie and J.C. Nichols whose promotion of this idea, whose creation of it in high-end subdivisions, proved tremendously influential. In fact, Nichols gave a speech to the National Association of Real Estate Boards, in which he outlined his model of planning for permanence and subdivision controls and restrictions. And that became like the speech was reported like hundreds of times, became the model everywhere. FHA in the 1930s picked it up and basically used Nichols' approach as the rules for subdivisions around the country. So these two people coming from these two places were enormously influential. And California was it had more real estate agents than anybody else. And because it was the 1919 decision of the state Supreme Court that was sort of uncertain until then, that said you can't stop a person from buying a home based on their race, but you can stop a person from living in it based on their race. So people would buy homes and then they'd be kicked out of them. So anyway, and that proved nationally influential too.
Gene, can I intervene for a minute, for a second?
Please. Sure.
Thank you for being here, first of all. But I wanted to ask you to state this question to you, actually. Do you see any change to what was going on in 1905 versus what's going on now?
Sure. Certainly, formal discrimination ended in, 1968 with the Fair Housing Act. So one couldn't publicly do this or formally do it, and it gave people rights. Has that been done, implemented fully? In fact, part of the argument I'm going to make here on this video is that it was the influence of the Realtors campaign against Proposition 14 in California in 1964 when they won 75% of the white vote for a campaign which Ronald Reagan and Barry Goldwater wouldn't touch for fear of being seen as racist. And the arguments they used about freedom, that led the Fair Housing Law to be dramatically weakened by both its advocates and its opponents. And so there was no administrative enforcement mechanism built. So I think what I see is rather the legacy, the lasting legacy of what was done in a world that in many ways has changed, but that lasting legacy remains with us. And the ideological legacy of this argument about freedom, has been the fundamental obstacle. And certainly there's more opportunities for people to move than there were, 50 years ago. Anyway, I could go on, but that's a quick answer.
I think you were in the video, you were about to talk about the two competing visions of freedom to buy and freedom to exclude. And maybe you should go into more detail because it's a very subtle and important distinction. Do you want me to start up again? Or
yeah, start up again.
And just take a look. There are some questions. I think
I'll look at the chat.
Questions are about, Berkeley isn't exceptional. Yeah, no. I think we agree.
Berkeley,
we're here.
Berkeley became the norm. That's the way of thinking about it.
And it didn't even start here in Berkeley. It's just we were part of the early leadership of these organizations, which what has changed, Willie, is they've apologized, but they haven't done anything about it beyond cosmetic stuff. They apologize for egregious racism.
There are rules, they're not enforced.
Yeah.
I think there would make an enormous difference if people lost their licenses rather than just,
we're going to get to that, how you think we could actually rein them in, but there's, let me just
how the Chinese Exclusion Act fit into this whole thing as well.
Okay, since that's earlier in history, why don't I answer that? Sure. So there were part of the question was, who could you legally exclude without violating the 14th Amendment? And when San Francisco passed an ordinance in 1877, obviously this is all of a piece, okay? And you can say the predecessor of all this, was the Chinese Exclusion Act and rules about Japanese. But when San Francisco passed an ordinance that required all Chinese to move to this, can't remember, environmentally hazardous area on the edge of the city. I don't remember where it was, within 60 days. That got stopped in the federal courts, and there were federal court rulings in the 1890s in San Diego that were seen as sort of the prevailing rules that said you can't have covenants that limit who can live somewhere. That was a finding of the appeals court. So what what McDuffie was doing was challenging that by taking this approach of covenants and in a somewhat new era. And that was so in fact, the legal battles, as well as the political battles over Chinese, preceded and provided a background to the story.
And okay, I'm just going to start
again,
and we'll pause when need be.
Doesn't seem to be a home.
Betsy, you're muted.
Massachusetts, the realtors had decided to go along with such laws and try and make them work. But the California Real Estate Association, headed up by their new president, Spike Wilson, who had been a news editor in Sacramento, headed the Fresno Realty Board, been president of local Kiwanis. He decided to take this up as a challenge and not merely try and overturn the law or get it amended, but to put a state constitutional amendment on the ballot. Remember, they had thought in 1948 of a US constitutional amendment to defend segregation. So here was the idea of a state constitutional amendment. They would go to the voters, they would collect 1 million signatures. And this ballot initiative called Proposition 14, a 1964 ballot, said neither the state nor any subdivision or any political subdivision, either any city or county, can ever limit the absolute discretion of an owner to sell or rent property to who he or she wants to and to use a broker to do it. This proposition created a problem from the realtor's point of view. This is the height of the civil rights movement, it's the height of support for American liberalism. It's the year that passed the federal civil rights law that most Californians supported. Lyndon Johnson's about to go on to crush Barry Goldwater in the 1964 election, but roughly 60% of the vote. The realtors were entirely isolated in making this argument. Not even the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce, their long ally, would support them. No business group would support them. Labor unions were against them. The Catholic Church and all the archbishops, almost all church leaders, civic groups. No conservative politician, not Barry Goldwater, who would oppose the Federal Civil Rights Act, nor Ronald Reagan at the time, would endorse the realtors for fear of being seen as racist. So how were the realtors going to wage this campaign? And the answer was to take on directly the argument for freedom that had propelled the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King at the March on Washington had used freedom 20 times, and equality once in his speech. And he talked about freedom, quoting the Gettysburg Address and going back to the Declaration of Independence, that freedom meant the shared freedom of all Americans, a freedom that had been denied in many ways, but this was reclaiming that freedom. It meant, as said in the Declaration of Independence, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Government is created to secure these rights, but that was the role of government. What Spike Wilson, this realtor and brilliant propagandist, did was he created an opposite idea of freedom. He began by writing a full-page newspaper ad called the Property Owner's Bill of Rights that he claimed and was put in newspapers throughout California and nationally. And it had a picture of a patriot from 1776 with one of those tricorner hats or a Liberty Bell, so the realtors were the new Paul Revere. And it laid out and said, these are the rights of property owners for which the revolution was fought. This is why America was created. To make this idea palatable, the realtors had to do a couple of things, and these had powerful influences on American politics. There's the things they had to solve for in winning a campaign, appealing to the vast majority of voters in 1964, in a liberal moderate state with Pat Brown, liberal two-term governor who had defeated Richard Nixon for re-election, making fair housing his highest priority. So what the realtors did was became the first language of colorblind freedom. They said, we're in favor of the same rights for everybody. The rights of all owners, the right to discriminate. There was the property owners. We are defending those rights. Am I anti-Negro? Spike Wilson asked at a meeting of the Apartment Owners Association in Los Angeles. By God, I am not. I am their greatest champion. They said, we are the defenders of equal rights, unlike the civil rights movement who only care about the interests of special groups. Because here was the key.
I'm sorry.
They took a single narrow
Could you
right,
mute
a right
yourselves?
nobody had ever talked about in 200 years, the right of an owner to say, well, I don't want the highest price for my home. I want to control the race of who I sell it to. A right that realtors themselves had violated with racial covenants for 50 years. They made this right. They took this right and elevated it as a single absolute right. And they said, this is the litmus test of American freedom. If government takes away this right, it's taking away your freedom. This is a last chance to defend American freedom. So what they were doing was they were defining freedom as a zero sum. Instead of Martin Luther King's idea of shared freedom, that requires government balancing those rights, like freedom of speech and freedom of the press, it always had to be balanced. Instead of that notion, it said, no, freedom belongs to you personally. It's your individual property, just like private property, in fact, with the analog of your own home. This is your freedom. And what government is doing is taking away that freedom to give special rights to others. Because freedom is these traditional rights, but the right not to be discriminated against, the right to buy a home in the first place, that was some special privilege, not rights. We hear this language now, with all the voting rights laws that being passed around, the restrictions on voting rights around the country. Surveys show, 80% of Republicans now view voting not as a fundamental right, but as a privilege to be limited to those, who deserve it. That was the rhetoric of the realtors. So they only talked about this one narrow right. And you can see this same idea, taking a single narrow right, calling it freedom itself, could and then would be used on issue after issue. It would be used on abortion, it would be used on guns. And in fact, part of the power, what's made conservatives successful, was not having an adventitious alliance of groups concerned about all these disparate causes, but using the same rhetoric of individual freedom, the heart of this. A key to this was calling, what the realtors did is they said, discrimination is a matter of, to discriminate is to choose. Discrimination is a matter of individual conscience and the dictates of your conscience. So they likened it to freedom of religion. What racial discrimination had to do with freedom of religion, can be hard to picture. But this is how they portrayed it, because freedom of religion could be seen as something sacred. And this idea, again, that it's taking away something. So what the realtors argued, and could argue in the campaign, was that you didn't need to be prejudiced to support Proposition 14. Far from it. You had to simply believe in American freedom and defending the rights of other people to enjoy their freedom. So on the billboards across on the Los Angeles freeways, the motto was freedom of choice, freedom to choose. This language of freedom of choice was so successful that in the 1964 ballot, the same ballot where Lyndon Johnson won 60% of the vote, 65% of the voters supported the realtors. 75% of the white voters, 82% of the white union voters, who had been the core support of the Democratic Party, in effect, splitting the FDR traditional Democratic coalition.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Gene, if you could bring us a little further up to date to the the Rumford Act in California and the response using these propagandistic ideas, but using them to defeat and undermine fair housing in California. Do you
Well, I
mind
think-
fast forwarding?
Sure. Isn't that what my alter ego has just been talking about?
Well, is
was
he going to
the-
get to that? Because he's sort of,
All right,
I'll
I'll
just stop.
summarize.
I'll stop.
I'll shorten
Yeah.
this if you want. Okay,
well,
so
I
they
know
ra-
we're not going to show the whole rest of the video.
Okay, all right.
So,
So
but
they
take
wound
us
up.
through the highlights.
So they ran this very successful campaign, even though they were totally isolated, opposed by every archbishop in California, by almost all religious leaders, by the unions, by many businesses. Even the Chamber of Commerce wouldn't support them. So they used this language, on billboards in Los Angeles, freedom of choice. They invented this, they linked it to religious freedom and, freedom of conscience, people's freedom of conscience. So it's really like freedom of religion. And they created a model they created two things. One, they created a powerful way of opposing fair housing that prevailed, for the next 4 years until fair housing finally passed. And I can get into how that happened in '68. But as I said, it was highly weakened by congressmen realizing, God, if you can get 75% of the white vote, in California, you can get that at least anywhere else in the country. So people were running in fear from the implications of this campaign. Ronald Reagan, who did support Prop 14, was running for governor 2 years later, and the California Supreme Court overturned Prop 14 as unconstitutional. Later went to the U.S. Supreme Court, but he then took up as a populist cause opposing these, few justices, and he made it the centerpiece of it. He made this concept of freedom, of sort of home ownership rights, of things local as opposed to the Cold War as a whole, the centerpiece of his ideological success. And this proved so successful for three reasons. One, this way of framing things. They took a narrow right that nobody had ever talked about, the right to sell homes without, to not sell a home to somebody who pays you the full asking price. That was basically the right they were saying was the backbone of the Bill of Rights. They defined that right as the litmus test of American freedom, and said any restriction on that means the end of American freedom for everybody. That was a method that could then be used on, gun rights, on abortion, on everything else. So that methodology got adopted. The second thing that happened was, this is basically a remaking of the Republican Party. Much higher percentage of Republicans than Democrats voted for, the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So this was the creation of a new Republican Party with this notion of freedom as its central image. And it was successful because it allowed Democrats from the South to join the Republican Party on a common theme without using the language of race, but just using the language of freedom. And the third thing it did is it allowed what was a splintered conservative movement between social conservatives who were generally many were Catholic, into blue laws and, prayer in public schools and other things the government would impose, from libertarians who were against sort of all government restrictions. So these were two opposite themes of conservatism. And the way they united was by using this common language of freedom, basically freedom meaning the right to maintain a past environment, an exclusive environment, an environment that you wanted to believe everybody had to have. So that created enormous power. So I think those are the two consequences of this notion of freedom that was created. I mean, I could go on, but I wanted to do that as a start.
You want me to start the video again?
I
will
don't care,
just.
or we can just, why don't we just go on? Why don't we just
Okay.
talk if people ask questions?
Yep. Well, I will, no, I can always ask. Let's let a couple of other people go first.
And I can talk about, you know, issues happening with affordability or these racism issues today in terms of housing, whatever.
Well,
and also the corporate investors buying single
Okay.
family homes.
So, not seeing other hands yet. Okay, Willie did raise a hand. Willie, may I introduce the piece that I really want to draw attention to, and that is the lobbying strength. So two things: the National Association of Realtors, this is second largest lobbyist, and this is the indoctrination and historic propaganda that they have spread through their networks. You don't have to join the Association of Realtors, but if you join your local Association of Realtors, you have to join the state, the California Association of Realtors, and the national. Both California and other states, and especially the national, have something they created called the Realtor Party. It's kind of a giggle, right? It's not a political party, it's a PAC. And it's an institute to train real estate folks who want to maintain this language, essentially how to be a skilled propagandist and how to intervene. They train, the Realtor Party trains you in how to pass bills in your city and state, and they are still at it. Like, I even have a screen share. And the reason I want to bring it up is that this is both the National and the California Association of Realtors have apologized publicly for egregious racism and illegal undermining of here, I'm going to try and share that. Let's see if I have it. If you look up the Realtor Party National, somewhere in there, and I have it. Sorry, I've lost the link. But I do want to just share that both of these entities, the National and the California, have apologized because they were exposed, and maybe even because members wanted to out this. They do have Black members now, and they do have progressive or liberal members who perhaps were as shocked as I was to realize just how detailed the conspiracy was, right? In 500 cities that had realtor boards, you know, this. So I encourage you to look that up. And I even have some numbers to show later about how much they're raising right now. And mostly they have spent it in California, and the National have both given money through PACs to defeat rent control propositions in the last 5 years. So I think I'll go on from there, but that's the coming into the present, and how do we, as housing justice advocates, and I'll ask you this too, Gene, although you're very much a skilled, policy writer. What do we do to shift that vision of freedom, which is freedom to exclude, that's supposed to be our essential freedom? In the meantime, yeah, I think that was an earlier question as well. Maybe things haven't changed, but how do we actually organize, or what kind of tools do you see, Gene and other people, to counter the influence of these lobbies?
Yeah, let me give the broadest one about freedom.
And you have three hands pending.
Okay, all right.
Good.
I can wait on.
Please
Okay.
go ahead. We're just signaling to ourselves.
Yeah, I see the three hands. that freedom was sort of abandoned by the left in this country, or by the liberals in this country, or whatever group you want to say, and ceded to conservatives after the 1960s. And what I've argued in the book is we need to redefine freedom and make it a term for liberals and progressives as a fundamental value, instead of being afraid of it or saying, oh, that's a conservative posture. And I've argued that, I mean, a whole set of tools, but the broadest one is to constantly frame issues in terms of there being two opposite kinds of freedom, and never talking about freedom per se, but challenging, exclusive freedom, freedom for only some people, with the notion of believing in inclusive freedom, freedom for everybody, freedom that belongs to the country as a whole, that isn't something you can build a white picket fence around because it's your private property. And so I think viewing every issue through that lens and using that vocabulary is a way on every one of these issues, including guns, abortion, every one of these issues that is modeled on this, to take that as a unifying approach. That's my broadest view, is to redefine and make this a central component, the central component of what liberals and progressives believe in.
Great. Julia, you haven't spoken, so I'm just calling on you first, but I see Willie, Norma, and Kelly as well.
Okay, am I muted or can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. Well, just as an aside, that I wish they would apply more of that concept of freedom to women, but that's not my main point.
It's the same concept of applying it to everybody. It's the same fundamental
idea. Yeah, but it's not being applied to everybody.
No, but that's precisely
the strategy we want to. He's recommending
the people. Fighting abortion restrictions is fundamentally a fight about freedom, about individual freedom.
Well, my other question was simply, I don't quite see what's in it for all of the realtors and the people who, what are they getting out of this continuing discrimination? I don't think they're all born racist. So, they must be making money out of it some way. That's the only thing I can see.
First of all, I don't view the realtors per se as, more racist than any other group in society. I don't think people become realtors because of that. And
no, that's why I'm asking the question.
And in fact, racism, I think in real estate practices, maybe it's gone from 98% to 10%. We're talking about a tremendous sea change. But there are lots of other things that go on that create discrimination that realtors aren't allowed to talk about. So people look up on their own school testing scores, in particular neighborhoods, and they make decisions on it. This is we're part of a whole algorithmic culture. So I don't think you have to say it's realtors doing stuff.
Well, you started out kind of that way, and when you were talking about the origins of
yes. Well, I'm talking about the period.
What I want to know is what's in it for them, other than because I can't believe they're all racist.
Well, let me differentiate the periods. Okay, so up to 68, and what drove this was it was a way of making money, right? Mm-hmm. That was what McDuffie and Nichols were about. They could get a premium for selling houses this way. Then as this became standard practice, realtors would always point out, they adopted the golden rule in 1924, in the same code of conduct in which they said that no realtor shall participate in selling a home to anybody who, because of their race, would lower property values. Of course, they're the expert on property values. So they applied they thought of this as part of the golden rule. And when asked about this, they said, well, I wouldn't want to treat my neighbor this way by putting a black family next to him. The golden rule was a limited rule. So, but what was in it for them was they said, look, we're being so good. We're not trying to profit by blockbusting in most cases. or, you know, we're foregoing sales that might be of higher value and give us a commission sooner. We're foregoing this because we're good guys, because we believe in the golden rule. This is what they said. But what this meant in practice was, instead of the free-for-all of real estate in the early 1900s, in which basically brokers on Los Angeles would stand on Los Angeles corners like streetwalkers, you know, hawking subdivision lots, or stand outside a broker's office and say, hey, I'll do half the commission that they will. What instead they shifted to through the multiple listing service was how to get repeat customers. And the way to get repeat customers was they had sold homes in neighborhoods where they said, as part of the buying mantra, was you're going to be protected from minorities. Okay. And if even one minority, that's how they sold covenants. If even one minority moves in next door, your, you know, property values will go down. So they knew their business depended on repeat customers. They were trying to sell not merely that house, but their ability to keep selling in that neighborhood. So they became part of this system driven by the need to preserve what they had established as their economic well-being. So I think that's what drove things.
At the early part.
Well, they
Yes.
were sort of creating the problem, and then, I mean, they were enforcing the ideas.
Yeah, I'm just saying,
appeal to these people.
why did
I mean,
why, if you're asking why did realtors in the 1950s adopt the same mantra, it's because of that. Long after values had changed.
I'd like to just respectfully add a piece. You guys know I spend a lot of time thinking about housing and injustice. I hope you do. But first off, you called this real estate, these associations, a cartel. And a friend of mine in Cambridge, who's a real estate agent, there is a subset of real estate agents who have viewed the National Association and the locals as cartels, meaning they conspire to drive up prices by limiting access. And from what I can see, and I'd love to hear from an economist, is that by creating a premium neighborhood that appeals to whites who are scared of diversity, by creating that premium, they get higher prices. And by creating what Hop Hopkins from the Sierra Club called throwaway people, throwaway neighborhoods. In other words, the what we would celebrate as multicultural neighborhoods with diverse activities. By creating that, those people who can only live there are paying 20 to 30% more.
Yeah,
You
but
mentioned
I don't think
and,
that I don't think that was an objective of realtors. Certainly, landlords in those neighborhoods
get a
and rental
premium.
agents did better as a result. But I think it's much easier to explain than I don't picture a conspiracy of realtors to drive up home prices across the country.
As
Because-
individuals, no, but
Yeah,
I
or
do
even
believe this
collectively.
is
I mean, do you think it's
the
benefiting-
Realtors Party is a specific organized group like
you may
ALEC.
know more about it. But
Okay,
I
yeah,
don't think
we have this.
Okay,
Well,
but
it
Go
just,
ahead.
it still seems to me that there's some profit motive in there
Yes.
somewhere. I mean, you don't just become a jerk for no reason.
right,
Well, the
and I'm explaining the profit motive by
Yeah.
wanting to maintain and expand market share, not by driving up prices. The other piece of the cartel, of course, was they doubled real estate by controlling 80% of sales to the multiple listing service early on, when there were only 40 of the 2,000 brokers in Los Angeles. Okay, they were able to double commissions from 3% to 6% and make it stick. That's the fundamental essence of a
Yeah.
cartel. That wasn't about driving up prices. That was about driving up commissions. So I think that's totally fully explained. And if
And-
you ask what the realtor's responsibility is today for what they did in the past, it's that they're still profiting from that doubling of commissions that was done under this regime.
So
And in fact, I got asked in the antitrust suit, you know, that's resulted in the change in the broker, I got consulted by the lawyers bringing the case again to, you know, what is the history of antitrust views of realtors? How was it used in the case of race? So yes, cartel is exactly a description of how it operates, but I don't think it's to drive up the prices of the product, but rather how much realtors make on it.
This is part of the ephemerality
I'm
of
sorry,
profit.
we had
I
Willie
know, I
had
know.
his hand
Next
up
is
and then
Willie.
you, Norma. Willie was next
Next,
and then
yeah.
Norma, if you don't mind.
Let Norma
Okay.
speak, and then I'll speak after,
My bad.
or whatever.
Go ahead.
Oh, Willie. I was saying about how ephemeral this whole construct of capitalism and profit is. And this is part of it. And another part of it is debt. Debt became, I'm asking Gene, did debt arise, this huge commodity that is a central commodity of a US economy, debt? People have been obligated to indebt themselves in order to this, that, and the other, buy a house, pay their bills. Did it become so evident for people through the practices of the real estate selling? I mean, even people that buy a house for over $1 million have to go, not all of them have to, not all of them are able to pay out of their pocket. It seems that the debt obligation is very common, and debt has become a central commodity. Hold on 1 second, because I got a thing to add to that. Israel has been allowed to do what it's doing because it's about Jews, and the idea that allowing the happening of Israel is much the same as what has been allowed for the campuses, whatever you want to call them, the places that have been sold under caveats of not having equality in selling.
Okay, it's a lot of points. So let me try and deal with them at a high level. I think the debt perspective, I think there's a great book by David Graeber on debt the first 5,000 years about the history of debt long before capitalism, that debt being a fundamental means of social control and economic exploitation. And so from that point of view, that's a much broader thing. I think debt in residential debt in America was a solution to an unaffordability problem. Because in the 1920s, before FHA, 1920s, if you wanted to buy a home, you generally needed to pay 50% down. That's why why homeownership was so low in this country, and in California in particular. Homeownership rates were very low. You had lots of rental single-family homes, something we're now recreating that I would like to talk about as how that's happening. But when they created 30-year mortgages, fixed rate, remember what happens in England today is people get loans that adjust the interest rate every 5 years, and suddenly they face, doubling of their monthly payment. So we created a solution to affordability in this country through this process, through creating low-cost, government-guaranteed debt. So I think actually that was a powerful invention. It's what led to the homeownership rate, becoming much larger. Not everybody was allowed to do so during the time when it was cheapest to do so. That's this whole issue of my book. But I don't think debt is the problem. I think, and we can talk about what drives prices. That's a whole other issue. But anyway, so those are, I can't remember, those were my main comment. I'll stay with, and obviously discrimination against anybody is like discrimination against anybody anywhere.
Thanks, Gene. I know we're going to circle back on all these topics, but Willie and then Kelly had questions. Are you with us? Kelly?
Are you there?
Okay, yes.
Can you hear me?
There you go,
I was
Willie.
muted. I'm sorry. I don't want to be long-winded, Gene. So as Betsy said, we are pretty chatty people, actually. But I wanted to just circle back around. Has anything really changed in Berkeley considering the demographics of North Berkeley?
That's an interesting question. First of all, I'm not an expert on Berkeley demographics, but I think, well, yeah, some things have happened, which is it's maintained North Berkeley, or I guess the Berkeley Hills, as highly, as premium neighborhoods at very high cost that I'm sure have been racially exclusive informally, if not formally, for many years. But that partly breaks down on racial grounds with, people being able to buy homes if they have high income. So, it's become more income, I think, stratified. But I think the other thing that's happened is the price of housing in even lower cost neighborhoods has gone up dramatically to the point where that is highly unaffordable compared to what it was to people in those neighborhoods 30 or 40 years ago. So and that affects demographics and who can afford to live there too. I mean, I'm no expert on this. I'm just giving you my off the top of ways I would think about that.
Maybe you could expand just a bit. How could it change? How can the prices come down? How can renters be a little more secure? Because I believe one of their elements was you don't want multifamily apartment buildings, and that there was lots of support from single family neighborhoods to exclude apartment buildings, which, we're over half renters in Berkeley, which I think is one of the reasons we actually have a rent board, an independent rent board. But the crises of both affordability for home ownership is also a crisis in renters.
Yeah, they're related. They're related.
Talk a little.
Crises.
How could we move the dial? If you have any thoughts on that, how do we move the dial towards more?
The first thing to do, this isn't so much California because they've done something about it, but in the rest of the country, is have the minimum wage indexed. I mean, what's happened is the national minimum wage hasn't gone up at a time when rents, forget home prices, have more than quadrupled. So, and the purpose of the minimum wage was in fact to enable somebody to live on a minimal supportable life scale, not in something fancy, but to be able to have enough to eat and have someplace they could find as shelter. It wasn't great conditions. And we've eliminated, and what's happened if you want to link the minimum wage to rents, then those things would have to align. Employers would have to pay more. There might be fewer jobs, prices and rents would come down. So I think if you want the single thing most important about what's driven unaffordability of rents in this country, it's been that, I think. Why is it more unaffordable than it was 30 years ago? The second issue, obviously, for both homeownership and rental is the supply issue. And obviously the questions of zoning, it's not only zoning, it's also, rules imposed by very liberal cities. San Francisco, after, they did the permanent supportive housing using, offsite home prefab, then got opposed by the unions because those weren't, jobs for those union members in the construction trade. There were other jobs in other kinds of factories. And so the city basically put a kibosh on that. So there are lots of kinds of rules that are being used for established interests that make housing that create fewer housing than would otherwise be built.
Thank you, Gene.
Okay.
Kelly has a question. She's a local, chronicler of all things Berkeley government, an incredible resource. And then Carol Morosevich has a question in chat about her passion. She's very involved in homelessness and commissions dealing with a number of issues here in Berkeley and housing. So Kelly, you take the floor.
Yes. Yeah, I follow all the new developments. I go to all the meetings on new developments. What could you say about the YIMBY movement and the belief in trickle down economics? I mean, this is what we hear a lot from, shall we say, the people under 35 are huge believers in YIMBY and trickle down housing. And if
what's the relation in YIMBY and trickle down, just so I understand
okay,
the connection it's perceived.
So as far as yes, YIMBY is yes in my
yeah, I know, yeah.
Okay. And then trickle down housing is like trickle down economics, that if you just build enough market rate housing, the prices will trickle down to you, and then you'll be able to get your dream, whatever it is.
So let me talk about the trickle down thing, first of all, because that's conventional wisdom. That was the wisdom when in San Francisco, I'm trying to remember the group that pushed for, building artist lofts and getting, deregulated to do that. And I argued the only impact was going to make it much more expensive for artists to live south of Market. And we got into a big fight over this campaign. So, and Paul Krugman has written, who I would kind of try to agree with on many things, has written the standard verbiage, which is the solution to affordable housing is just build market rate housing. And then you'll increase the supply, and therefore, and I think that is, I could send around what I wrote to him. I think that's untrue. It's true at a macro scale, but not true at a micro scale, at a neighborhood or city scale. It's true at a metro area scale. So if you build, we got hired by San Francisco in 1980. Well, I'll skip that long story. Okay. What happens when you build expensive housing in an area that's, doesn't have as much expensive housing? Let's say, in south of Market, or, along the, what was built, by China Basin and so forth. What is or in Hunters Point, or anywhere, or in Manhattan? What is the impact of that? The impact is to increase prices in the surrounding area, because it makes that neighborhood trendy. It makes that area safe. It makes that area perceived as a hotter place to be. And therefore, prices go up in that area. So I think it's total fallacy to think that simply building market housing reduces unaffordability in that area. I think generally, in case after case, it increases unaffordability. I think where it's true, because there are basic laws of supply and demand, is it's true at the metro or the broader metro area. So if you build more high cost housing in San Francisco, let's not assume about people moving from abroad and other stuff, but if you build more high cost housing, the price of housing in Stockton and Vallejo may marginally drop or wouldn't increase as much because you've added to the overall metropolitan supply. But that's not true on a local level. I'd make that distinction.
And can I quote you on that? Thank you.
Sure, I'll send Betsy what I wrote to Paul Krugman about this.
Okay, I'd love it. Thank you.
He never responded.
Well, I think you have a number of people who are at least entertaining, if not are already aware that just building affordable housing just building market rate housing hasn't yet peaked enough to do anything in Berkeley, except maybe, you know what? I'm not going to get into it because I don't have the basis. Yes, we'll listen to you. We'll send your article. And then Carol Crooks asked a question. I'll just read it, but if you want to take it yourself, Carol, please do. Do you see that? She asked, do you see a relationship with homelessness and how that is emerging? We're all very passionate about that issue. What is the relationship with rentals? The Cabrini Green housing project in Chicago began with providing housing for Blacks and Italians because landlords would not rent to Blacks and Italians. And I believe Cabrini Green was torn down and is used as like an abject, this is to the group, abject lesson in why you don't want public housing. So, but maybe you could speak to the relationship with
let me go-
homelessness.
Yeah.
That was
as
Carol
well.
Mirosevich.
Yes, that was Carol's.
Well, on the
Mirosevich.
homelessness question, two things have happened in this country, three things. One is we eliminated the places where people who are now homeless used to live. San Francisco tore down or converted or allowed to convert 15,000 units of single room occupancy hotels, not very good housing, terrible housing, but converted to, either were torn down or converted to commercial hotels. If you want to know how many, I don't remember the numbers on how many homeless people in San Francisco there are, but I bet it's pretty similar to the number of units that were eliminated. Los Angeles eliminated somewhere between 15 and 20,000. So I think there's a direct one-to-one correspondence between eliminating the kinds of cheap, not very good housing people used to live on rather than live on the street, and basically forcing them to live on the street. So number one is removing that supply in the interests of either commercial development, or it'll make neighborhoods better, or urban renewal, or, we're going to make housing conditions better for people. So I think that's explanation one. Of course, got layered on with, what happened with mental hospitals closing in Reagan and that whole trend. So that added a second. But I think the market increase in homelessness over time is clearly related, other than those two initial factors, is clearly related to the price of housing. I mean, as the price of housing goes up, more people will not be able to afford any. And if you eliminate substandard housing, then by definition, people will be on the street. The big increase in homelessness among families facing homelessness. I mean, one of the things we're doing in Anaheim, for example, but we did this in Washington State, is creating a, first month's and last month's rent, sort of program, which at a very low cost keeps people from becoming homeless. So I don't know, homelessness is a whole issue on its own terms, but that would be my immediate question. Cabrini Green. I used to live about 6 blocks from Cabrini Green for 5 years. This is a very complicated story about public housing.
Carol used to live in Chicago.
Yeah,
She
I lived there.
was a lawyer there.
I lived
Yeah.
there from 77 to 82.
Nancy is next.
I'm not sure let's go on to another question. That's a whole
Nancy.
thing of itself.
Nancy
Okay,
Okada,
hi,
welcome.
Okay. I had a question. Gus Newport was a big proponent of community land trusts, and I wondered if you think that might be a possible solution to the housing affordability crisis.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So housing, we've worked with a lot of public agencies around the country. A few of them have dealt with land trusts, not a lot. Land trusts are a way of regulating the future, basically. It's a control mechanism to maintain affordability. So I think of it in terms of what are the tools that can be used to do that. And I think land trusts can be effective. I think they're very small scale in the country. I think it's hard to get people to buy into them, and there's costs involved. The two alternatives that we deal with, first of all, in rental development, we try and make certain that affordability is, a minimum of 30 years or 55 years in California, or 99 years. We're doing stuff for Atlanta at the moment where by state rules, it's hard to enforce regulatory restrictions for more than 20 years to bind future owners. So what we're proposing, this is the call I was on this morning, is it's sort of like a land trust in some ways, is a developer can get a property tax exemption if the land is owned by a public agency, and they've created this spin-off of the Atlanta Housing Authority, who can basically enter into these property tax exemption agreements. And effectively, to do that, we're doing this in New Orleans as well. To do that, we're making basically the public agency owns the ground, has the ground lease. So we can require affordability for 55 years or whatever number is desired. So I think that's one of the tools. The other tool, we worked on a program, didn't get implemented quite the way we wanted, but for the Treasurer's Office in California in 2022, we designed the California Dream for All program. You can look it up on the Treasurer's website, the whole report we helped write on this. And basically this said, if you're going to give large amounts of down payment assistance to, working class people to buy homes in California, which is critically needed, that should not be, we just give somebody a 0% deferred payment loan, they pay us back when they sell the home, because that doesn't give you enough money to help the next buyer. Yes, it provides more of a windfall to the first buyer. And I've had lots of discussions with the Black Head of Housing in DC and elsewhere to convince them that in this whole discussion of we ought to do things about racial equity, that providing a way of investing public funds in future affordability, we're helping multiple generations, actually winds up helping many more people become homeowners and build more household wealth than if you simply said, oh, we'll forgive that amount, or we'll make it a grant, or you pay us back at 0%. So that creates more racial equity. Can I talk about the corporate landlords? I'd like to talk about that at some point.
Yeah.
You're on mute. You're on mute.
Yes. So actually, could we take a 5-minute bio break? Are you good to be with us?
I'm only good till 3:30.
Oh, well then let's just say we'll take, I think I need a bio break.
Okay.
And Carol, this was something she really wanted us to address, and we all do. Well, she and I really want to address this. And the National Gray Panthers and some of our other California chapters are very interested in what can be done about institutional large-scale investors.
Anybody take bio breaks and I'll talk forward.
I'm
Or I can
it.
answer, Kelly has a question.
Listen.
Maybe I can answer your question. Meanwhile, all people who need to take bio breaks.
Okay, I have another one for you. And that is, I read Patrick Condon's book, Sick City, Disease and Inequality, Urban, but it basically it says that if you put multiple units on a piece of property, it doesn't really decrease the price because it increases the value of the land.
Okay, so let me answer that. So during the pandemic, we got asked, in response to my book, I got put on a panel with a Los Angeles chapter of the American Institute of Architects, the guy from city planning who was rewriting the city's zoning code, and a few other folks from LA. And their proposal was the easy fix to unaffordability is let's double the density of allowable development on corridors throughout Los Angeles, like 350 miles of corridors, like tens of thousands of units. And that'll bring down the cost of housing because we'll build all that. And what we said to them, because we've seen people who've tried this, Phoenix, for example, tried this and has the exact opposite result for maybe the reason you're thinking of, which is if you say to people, you can build 10 units instead of 5 units or whatever it is, whatever the number is, it's going to increase the expected price people expect to get from selling their land. And so you wind up with housing, both market rate and affordable housing, not being built. And that was the impact in Phoenix. You basically have owners who think their land is worth $20,000 a lot, suddenly thinking it's worth $40,000 a lot. So the market basically hasn't changed, but you know, and the economics and, you know, rents and prices. So it doesn't have the intended result. So what we said is this should be saying we will double the density on anybody who's providing 20% or 40% affordable housing with that extra density. As long as you're, in effect, you don't want to increase land values. You want to use the increase in value to make it possible to do affordable housing. So there's a right way to do that and a wrong way. Let me talk about the corporate housing, if I can, for a second.
Yes, yes. This
Okay.
this is, we have it here in Berkeley, we have it here in the East Bay, we have it here in San Francisco.
So what happened, and I won't get into all the reasons why it happened, but you wound up with hedge funds initially drawn into buying up single family homes for rent or for flipping with Goldman after the financial crisis, and put it along at a slow level. And then about 5 years ago, this really took off in 2019 or so, and particularly during the pandemic. And so you had hedge funds, Blackstone being an example, but there are lots of these, who were basically have been using computer programs to buy up 100, 1,000 homes at a crack. And the reason, and what happens is they're basically they're undermining the entire American system of individual home ownership. Because individual home buyers, first-time buyers, and they're buying stock that's particularly focused on what first-time buyers would buy. They're not buying, you know, high-end stuff. They're not even they're buying below median cost. They're particularly buying in a lot of neighborhoods where minorities would otherwise be buying, on existing minority neighborhoods or the edges of those neighborhoods. It's happening in Atlanta. It's happened in Phoenix, Nashville, Memphis, lots of places you could name. And why did this take off? It took off because these hedge funds had raised enormous amounts of capital to invest generally in real estate, in rental real estate of one type or another. But during the pandemic, you weren't going to invest in office buildings, and you weren't going to invest in shopping malls, and you weren't going to invest in retail. So there were only two things you could invest in with all this money they had raised. One was, you know, warehousing facilities for Amazon and the equivalents around the country, because those have, you know, proven very stable and are steady and are only increased by the pandemic. And the other thing is you go buy single family homes and turn them in, or you could go invest in rental property. And the focus became, okay, we're going to buy up single family homes and in effect destabilizing communities, for one thing, and limiting opportunities for people to become homeowners. And I say it threatens the fundamental of the American home ownership system, because the whole system built up with FHA and VA and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac for all these decades basically requires home buyers to go through, you know, provides opportunities for people to buy homes, but it can't compete with people who can buy homes on a click of a computer button. And the realtors did a detailed analysis of this. The reason people sell homes to these corporate funds is not because they're going to get a higher price. The price is about the same or maybe a little lower. It's because of the convenience. Nobody has to do an inspection. Nobody has to go visit the property. You know, you don't necessarily need a broker. It's like a whole set of conveniences and computer algorithms. So it undermines the fundamental premise of home ownership in this country. And so lots of people were talking about this. J.D. Vance's first speech when he ran for the Senate was about this issue, okay, to give a flavor. So Republicans talked about this as well as Democrats. It's happening, if anything, more in red states than in blue, but it's come to California in a big way, sort of slowly. Now about 30% of single family homes being sold in California are sold to hedge funds. Okay, think of that number. And the argument back from the hedge fund people that they're using politically is, well, this is only a small share of the market. There have always been rental single family homes, but this is different than mom and pop landlords. And it doesn't matter the share of homes owned by these. What matters is the impact of reducing the inventory available to everybody else, and particularly in selective neighborhoods where you're half the houses, okay, go away and there's no inventory. So lots of people were talking about this. There were White House conferences, and I got upset because lots of people were talking about it. Nobody was proposing anything other than some unconstitutional bills under this, or certainly under this Supreme Court, any Supreme Court. You can't simply prohibit who can buy homes. It'll be unconstitutional, nor can you impose, a new special tax on such owners that some people this junior senator from but I'm forgetting in Oregon was proposing. So my friends and I came up with I have 2 minutes here, came up with a very simple approach that got incorporated. We ran by the White House, and then which hilariously, I'm a consultant, right? And the White House says to me, okay, you've managed after multiple hours of convincing us it's a good thing to regulate, even though it reduces the number of rentals and blah, blah, blah. So how do you expect to get this through? What's your strategy for getting this through Congress? They're asking me. This should tell you something about the White House. And so I said, well, it seems like we should go to Sherrod Brown, chairman of the Banking Committee, who's been arguing about this. So after a year, we got a bill introduced. And what it does, it's called the Stop Predatory Investing Act, if you want to look this up. And what it says is that if you own, in this case, buy more than 50 rental single family homes nationally, you in a partnership, you as a partner, you as a hedge fund, whatever it is, if you do that, you no longer get the interest deduction that homeowners get or that other rental landlords get, and you don't get the depreciation deduction. So you reduce the rate of return these hedge funds are looking at by half, from 15% to 7% or something. Depends on the particular hedge fund and their leveraging strategy. So I think this is a great idea. And we've tried to get some GOP members. I talked to some GOP people who said, well, this is a really important issue. We think it would be a populist issue for our constituents. It would help us in red states. But nothing's going to happen before the election. But anyway,
Gene,
I have to go.
Can we invite you back when you're well rested? Let's get you back if you're willing, because we still have questions. And this corporate investor thing is ongoing, and I know you want us to take some action.
If people look at the Stop Predatory Investing Act, and maybe in the fall I can come back. Okay. Thank you.
Repeat the name of the act, predatory something.
Stop Predatory Investing Act.
Thank you.
Okay, gotta go. Thank you.
All right. We didn't even get to applaud. Carol, you had a question. And I'm sorry you didn't get to ask it.
It's okay.
Oh, Carol, I thought it was Carol Crooks who had a question, but anyway, wow. Well, thank you all. We actually have time for discussion. Although usually we close formally at 3:30 and then we have informal discussion till 4. So I'm looking for input. We could take a short break. We can adjourn now and take a short break, but I do want you to know we're having a board meeting next week. We'll take up some of the practical decisions we need to make. And we also have in August, our meeting, I forget the date, it's always the 4th Wednesday, and we will be able to revisit some of this and even have another speaker, if not Gene, about the election, because we start the election season discussions in August. So.
And before we stop the recording, where can people learn about all these great things, including our social next month?
Why
Don't stop recording. I'm gonna say something fantastically important.
Okay, I mostly wanted to make sure that we said it's at eastbaygraypanthers.org.
Yeah, the website has information about upcoming events and occasionally links to recording
Campaigns. And we do post
somewhat. Yeah,
recordings of past
keep in
ones.
touch. So for our voting members, we have social events, and other people are certainly welcome. And also at the board meetings, we just ask that you check in. Yeah, they're just not quite as public as this, but I'm appreciating everyone here.
Go take your break. You need a break?
I
Go-
took my break.
Oh, okay. No,
So
no,
I'm unless there's objection, is there an objection to ending the formal part of the meeting now? And then we can continue. That just means I don't have to keep intervening. But I think we want to hear from people. Any objection to closing the formal part of the meeting? And then we'll stay on till 4. The Zoom room is open and some of us will stick around. Hearing no objection, our meeting is East Bay Gray Panthers is formally adjourned. And now welcome everyone who came in a little bit late. It's great